technology-based startups support U.S. economic growth. My name is on there, but really all the 99% of the credit belongs to my colleague John Wu, who's done a heroic job of wading through a ginormous data set to really try to understand, really for the first time, or close to the first time, an empirical look at high technology startups in the U.S. economy. So the format today, we will adjourn precisely at 11. I will give a little bit of framing remarks about why this is an important issue. John will go through the methodology and then the major findings of the report. I'll then segue a little into some of the policy implications. And then we have three great panelists who will respond with their own thoughts and reactions. And then we should have plenty of time for some questions or comments from you all. Let me start by introducing John Wu as a research analyst here at ITIF, and we're pleased to have him. Jeff Farah is the Vice President of Government Affairs at the National Venture Capital Association, which obviously is the trade association for venture capital firms in the U.S. who, as we note in this report, play a pretty critical role of driving and enabling technology-based startups. Prior to joining NVCA, Jeff was counsel to the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee, where he advised Chairman Thune and Republican members on a wide array of issues related to technology and communications and internet policy. Prior to that, he worked for Senator Scott Brown and was also a member of Governor Romney's presidential campaign on the policy team. Scott Stern is the David Sarnoff Professor of Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Actually, probably don't remember who David Sarnoff is. Famous, Radio Corporation of America, one of America's first high-tech electronics companies. Yeah, he's a distinguished entrepreneurial leader in American history. So if you haven't seen Scott's work, it really is the best scholarly work out there on high-growth entrepreneurship and high-tech entrepreneurship. He's done really amazing, both empirical as well as policy work on this. His work explores how innovation and entrepreneurship differ from traditional economic activities. He focuses on entrepreneurial strategy, innovation policy and management, and innovation ecosystems. Prior to that, he was a professor at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. He's also been the founder and co-director of the Innovation Policy Working Group at NBER. Finally, Dave Thomas. David is the Senior Director of Research, Industry Research Analysis at BIO. Probably worth saying that BIO, does BIO have a real name anymore, or is it like IBM? I mean, it's the Biotechnology Industry Organization.
Just our name last year. It used to be the Biotech Industry Organization.
Right.
Now it is the Biotechnology Innovation.
Oh, okay. Very good. Right. In any case, the trade association of biotechnology companies in the United States, of many of which, in fact, the vast majority of which are startups in the last 10 years who are driving all sorts of really amazing and important drug discoveries. Prior to joining BIO, David was a research scientist at the Craig Ventnor Institute, working on the synthetic cell team there. He also has been a scientist at Amgen and Novartis and other companies. So unlike the rest of us, David is a real scientist who has a real background and understanding of this from an enterprise perspective. Okay, so let me just jump right in. So why are we talking about high technology startups? About 70 years ago, John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous economist, spoke for most American economists and American economic policymakers when Galbraith said, quote, "The entrepreneur, as many see him, is a selfish type motivated by greed, and he is therefore unhappy." This was sort of a common view of entrepreneurs. These were the losers who couldn't make it in the big corporate world where real innovation and success happened. Clearly, this was a mistaken view, and over the last couple of decades, it's really been remedied, and now entrepreneurs are celebrated. But perhaps too much so, because now we're at a point where, as Mike Lind and I write in our new book coming from MIT Press in the spring called Big is Beautiful, rebutting the myth of small business. We're at a point where two kids opening up a lemonade stand could be called entrepreneurs if it were not for child labor laws. So this term has become so broad to almost become meaningless. When Schumpeter wrote about entrepreneurship, what he wrote, which I think is the exact right definition, he said, quote, "The function of entrepreneurs is to reform or revolutionize the pattern of production by exploiting an innovation or more generally an untried technological possibility for producing a new commodity or producing an old one in a new way." So what Schumpeter talked about as entrepreneurship is not just simply somebody going up and opening a store. It's doing something new that is new to the market, largely related to technological innovation. So I think that's really the key question. And the scholarly work on that really demonstrates that very clearly. As Scott's colleague at MIT, Antoinette Scorer writes, "It is crucially important to differentiate between two distinct sets of entrepreneurs, subsistence and transformational entrepreneurs." And what she means by subsistence entrepreneurs are the majority of people who start a business who just don't want to work for other people. That's, when you look at this evidence, most people who start companies don't like working for other people. And they start a company and they might have 3 or 4 people. Maybe one of them is their cousin and one of them is their wife or their husband. And they don't grow. But there's a small set of entrepreneurs who are transformational entrepreneurs. And that's really the focus of what we're looking at today. Or as Scott's work has shown, I'm going to quote from an article Scott wrote, why this is important. He writes, quote, "Quantity-based measures of entrepreneurship have little relationship to GDP." In other words, what he means is just simply measuring the number of small businesses really has no relationship. So the way to think about that is how we talk about it is that there are startups, there are technology-based industries, and there are high-growth firms. And there's 3 distinct kinds of firms. And what we're really looking at is that very small Venn diagram overlap, which makes up 0.3% of all U.S. firms, which are startups in the technology-based sector who are wanting to grow or growing quite rapidly. Now, why are we looking at those firms? Add, by the way, this great quote, which I think gets to the thing. If you haven't seen Mark Andreessen's tweet, Mark Andreessen, the founder of Netscape and now leader at Andreessen Horowitz in the Valley, there's too much entrepreneurship, disruption running wild, there's too little entrepreneurship, the economy's stalling out. What Andreessen's referring to is there has been a decline of small business startups. And a lot of people say that's a crisis. And I think the key point there is it's probably not a crisis if fewer people are opening up pizza parlors and hardware stores. The real question for policymakers is what's happening to the high-growth, technology-based and innovation-based entrepreneurship. And that's where Andreessen's saying there's a disruption. It's running wild. And so we wanted to look at that question and say, how are we doing as a nation in that? This is important because just when you look at the technology sector, which is defined broadly to include sectors like biotechnology, semiconductors, software, and the like, they only make up 3.6% of U.S. jobs. But they account for 6.2% of U.S. output, 8% of wages, so incredibly high-wage sectors, 27% of all U.S. exports, 58%, 59% of R&D jobs, and 70% of all R&D investment. So this small set of technology companies, go back here, that circle here, technology businesses, drive much of U.S. economic success. Now, if we're not renewing that through birth, if you will, that eventually is going to run out. And so the real question is, how well are we doing at renewing that? And when you look at the difference between technology-based startups and typical startups, there's a big difference. So a typical startup might be in a restaurant industry, a typical startup in a tech-based biotech or IT, large potential for growth in employment and revenue. Yet you look at most small businesses, they hire a few people, and then the median experience of a small business is to go out of business within 5 years. More businesses go out of business than stay in business. That's not true for this smaller segment of technology-based startups. Job creation. More high-wage jobs in the tech sector The wages are much, much higher. The average small business startup pays below the average wage in the U.S. The average technology startup pays significantly more. Jobs. I note with amusement, looking at the debate over the tax bill and the sort of concern for cutting the taxes on what are called pass-throughs, which are small business, and a lot of the rhetoric is that these companies are job creators. The vast majority of them are not job creators. What they do is they substitute for one company versus another. So when a entrepreneur opens up a restaurant in Rockville or Arlington, they're not creating jobs. They're just taking jobs from somebody else. So you're not going to go out and buy more dinners. You're just going to go from that restaurant to a different restaurant. So the multiplier from most of these small businesses is zero. The multiplier from these high technology startups is very, very large. A number of good studies on this that suggest for every job one of these companies creates internally, they support the creation of 5 jobs externally. And R&D investment, and then importantly trade. The U.S. is running a fairly massive trade deficit, and it would be worse if we did not have the kind of robust technology-based startups we have today. So that's why this is an important issue. I'm going to turn this over to John now, and he will talk about the methodology and the findings of the report.
Hi, morning all. Thank you all for coming. Hope you had a lovely Thanksgiving. So basically I'll be just running through the methodology, overall findings, and state and congressional district findings. To put our report simply, we just look at the number of tech startups. Are they going up or down? Employment within these startups, has it grown? And kind of the wages among these startups, kind of what levels are they at? More sophisticated analyses is such as the work of Scott Stern and his colleague Jorge Guzman over at MIT does much more sophisticated work in terms of the quality of such startups. But if you have not yet read his work, I highly recommend it. It's a very fun but technical read. So in terms of how we quantify tech-based industries, first we looked at kind of all the industries in the US and kind of whether they had an above average or below average R&D intensity. And R&D intensity is basically an innovation metric which measures the amount of a company's or an industry's sales or revenues that they reinvest into R&D. So at the national level, I think the US average is about 3%, and we kind of narrow down the industries to about 10 industries which have R&D intensities ranging from between 4% and 28%. So most of the core data that we did this study is from the Business Dynamics Research Consortium out of the University of Wisconsin Extension. They have been a massive help in terms of helping us understand this massive data source that kind of provides firm level data. So each individual company in the US that's either a biotech firm, a pharmaceutical firm, electronic firm, all goes into here. Wage data is from the US Census Longitudinal Employer and Household Dynamics Survey, and it kind of provides wages based on firm age at the industry level. Oh, so I guess right to the meat of things. Oh, sorry, my bad. Yep. Last but not least, we have the venture capital data from PitchBook, which was kind of made available to us through our connections over at the National Venture Capital Association. So shout out to Mariam Hawk, a colleague of Jeff, over at the NVCA for helping us secure that data. And last but not least, there's no hard and fast rule as to what exactly or how old exactly is a startup is. In this report, we define a startup as a firm that is actually 10 years or less in age, and we have seen studies that mainly define a startup as anywhere between 0 in age to all the way to 16 years of age. So there's a wide disparity in terms of how various people define what a startup is. So the 10 industries that we ended up selecting are as follows. As a side note, the semiconductor components industry is a sub-industry of the computer and electronics industry. We just pulled it out to analyze startup trends within the industry itself because it has one of the highest R&D intensities among all industries in the US. So for overall findings, if you have yet to read our report, we mainly look at the number of startups, employment in these startups, wage growth in these startups, high growth startups, early stage startups, survival rates of these startups, and I believe I'm forgetting one thing, but I blame that on my jet lag. I just got back from Singapore last night. So at the aggregate firm level, tech startups have more or less been more robust now than in 10 years ago. But at the same time, that finding differs based on industry. So I don't really need you to scrutinize the percentages on the charts too much, but more or less pay attention to the difference in the pie sizes for the same colored slice across both pies. On the left side, we break down kind of tech startup activity by the number of firms in 2016, and on the right side we break down tech startup activity by employment in 2016. Just want to draw your attention to that about 85% of tech startups are in service providing industries, whereas employment among these service providing startups kind of only make up 65% of all tech based employment. But that's not to say that there are fewer manufacturing startups, or at least startups in the manufacturing side of things has not grown too much over these past 10 years. In fact, from our report, we find that startups in the pharmaceuticals, computer and electronics, semiconductors and aerospace has actually grown over these past 10 years. It's just that there are many more smaller size service providing startups that has grown, that has kind of crowded out the tech startup sphere to kind of present this overall look of things where it seems as though there are way much more service providing startups than manufacturing tech startups. For comparison, a manufacturing based startup on average employs 10 or more workers, whereas a service providing startup employs about 5, and in the case of computer system and design services, on average they employ about 3 people in 2016. So looking at overall trends, we find that since 2007, the number of startups has increased by 47% from 116,000 firms in 2007 to about 171,000 in 2016. Overall, firms have kind of only increased by 40%, and as such, startups make up a larger share of the economy now than in 2007. They currently make up about 73% of all tech firms. This contrasts to the typical startup in the US economy, which only accounts for about 51% of all firms. So this point more or less highlights the dynamic nature of the high-tech industry. Employment in these startups have also grown by about 20% since 2007, from about 1.1 million workers to 1.5 million workers. And as a share of total employment, they account for about 33% of all tech-based employment. Per my previous point, they also account for a much larger share of employment as compared to the typical startups in the economy, which only account for about 19% of total employment, which also speaks to the fact that the typical startup is small and really doesn't really grow too much. So tech startups also pay very high wages, and the wage rates that they are offering are growing. From 2007 to 2016, wages among tech-based startups has actually increased by 20%, and that's in real wages, so after you account for inflation. So in 2016, they offered about twice that of the national average and about 3 times that of the typical startup. Just as a side note, I just want to point out that typical startups have actually decreased in the real wages that they're paying out to the American worker. And as another side note, wages also differ by industry. The pharmaceutical industry pays the highest wages, followed by service providing industries, and even the lowest paying sector, which is the semiconductor machinery manufacturing sector, pays around $50,000 odd as their annual average wage, which is still higher than the national average. Early stage startups are those that have yet to develop market-ready revenue-generating product, and they are often engaged in the highest risk and highest reward kinds of innovation. And so they are a really important component of the innovation ecosystem. And over the past decade, they have more or less shrunk in size and have also accounted for a smaller share of the economy. In 2007, about 15% of startups were in their early stage, whereas this figure has decreased to about 10% in 2016. Early stage startups tend to be small, and in total they employ about 100,000 workers in the tech sector, which is about 3% of all tech-based employment. Looking at industry differences, pharmaceuticals has kind of the highest share of early stage startups. And this has increased from about 25% as a share of all startups in 2007 to about half of all startups in 2016. But at the same time, we see that across industries, medical devices, there hasn't been much changes there. And in the data processing services sector has actually shrunk, whereby there are fewer early stage startups in the data processing services now than 10 years ago.
I want to just clarify, you mean early stage in terms of revenue?
Yep, and it's clarifying. We define early stage based on kind of a revenue threshold. So if firms in these industries earn below a certain level of revenue or sales, we consider them an early stage company. Venture capital backed startups are an important component of any economy, and as such, we look at venture capital-backed startups through data provided by PitchBook. VC investors tend to kind of seek out the highest rates of returns for their investments, and more often than not, this should more or less be in the tech sector. VC-based firms actually make up less than half a percentage point of all startups, but in the tech-based sector, they make up about 11% of all startups, and this differs based on industry too. As another component of our analysis, we actually look at industry by industry startup trends. And so we just wanted to highlight a couple key findings from the pharmaceutical sector. So the pharmaceutical sector actually represents about 16% of all US R&D, but actually only 1% of all US output. From 2007 to 2016, the number of tech startups in the pharmaceutical sector has increased by 56%, from 1,000 firms to 1,600 firms. And that makes up about 66% of all pharmaceutical firms in the industry. However, employment has actually decreased by 24% over this period. So in other words, pharmaceutical firms have grown smaller, or at least pharmaceutical tech startups have grown smaller over this past 10 years. Couple other interesting things is, as I said previously, pharmaceutical firms offer the highest wages, and in 2016 they paid out an annual average of $140,000, and this compares to kind of the industry average of the pharmaceutical sector of $127,000. And it's actually one of the few industries whereby tech startups pay a higher wage than the overall industry average. About 15% of new pharmaceutical firms do not survive past their first year, whereas only 55% of these pharmaceutical firms survive past their fifth year. This contrasts kind of the typical US startup average of about 48%. Going on to findings at the state and congressional district level. As we would expect, larger state economies tend to have more startups and more employment in tech-based industries. California has over 30,000 tech startups that employ over 300,000 people, whereas Wyoming has 250 tech startups employing only about 1,300 workers. In the median state, there are 1,800 tech startups out of 76,000 firms and 17,000 jobs in tech startups out of 1.6 million workers. And that represents more or less 2.4% of all businesses and 0.9% of all jobs in the median state. So controlling for the total number of businesses and the total number of employment at the state level kind of helps provide a better gauge of how each state is doing in terms of their tech startup activity. We find that western states and northeastern states plus Colorado and Texas seem to be doing best in terms of tech startup activity. New Hampshire is the state with the highest tech startup activity as in terms of tech startups as a share of all technology-based firms at I say again, tech startups as a share of all firms at 4.7%, and Massachusetts comes in 7 at 4.3%. This map is very simple to read. Dark is better, light is less good. Onwards towards tech startup firm share. This kind of shows the firm share of tech startups across all the states and kind of ranked from the lowest to the highest. And as we find, most states have very similar levels of tech startup activity. Between 2 to 3% of all their businesses are involved in the tech. Between 2 to 3% of all their businesses are tech startups. We see kind of high variance in terms of the states 1 through 10, but whereas at the lower end of the spectrum, we kind of see that the states don't really differ much in terms of tech startup activity. In terms of employment share, it tells a similar story, whereby most states have similar levels of employment in tech startups. About 0.75% to 1.2% of their workforce is engaged in tech startups. Massachusetts has the highest employment share of tech startup employment at 2.4%, and this far out exceeds the next highest state of California. As an interesting point, we find that there's a correlation of 0.75 between a state's level of technology-based startup activity and ITIF's 2017 State New Economy Index. If you have not read our 2017 State New Economy Index, please do. It's a very interesting read. Rob and I did that too. That's why I'm shamelessly plugging it. But anyway, in the index, we more or less look at how a state's economic structure fits into the new economy. So we rank a state based on 25 indicators, which range between kind of their R&D investments, their knowledge workers, their STEM workers, their economic dynamism, and their level of globalization. So more or less this correlation points out that states that are more attuned to the new economy have a better, or at least have an easier time attracting tech startups to them. At the congressional district level, we find that in the median congressional district, there are 300 tech startups out of 13,000 firms, 2,300 jobs out of 250,000 workers, and I'm just going to run you through the top 5 congressional districts in terms of tech startup activity. Number 1 probably comes at no surprise. California 17, which is part of Silicon Valley. About 16% of all their businesses are in tech startups. This might be a low percentage or high percentage depending on how well you think Silicon Valley is doing. Coming next, we have Virginia 10, which is just outside DC. Then we have Texas 2, which looks like a snake, followed by Washington 1, just outside Seattle, and Virginia 8, which is Alexandria and Arlington. So mainly tech startups just outside the DC area is booming. Unfortunately, we didn't look into tech startups in DC itself, which probably would be an interesting thing to look into too. Just as a side note, Virginia 8 has about 8.3% of its businesses are tech startups, and this contrasts with Silicon Valley, which is 16.1%. So between the 1st congressional district and the 5th congressional district, there's such a high disparity out of all 435 congressional districts. So I'm just turning this back to Rob for his policy recommendations.
Well, thank you, John. Before I do that, a couple of quick things. One, the slides will be on our website, so if you want to just sort of follow up with that in the coming days, you can do that. Also, there's data on every single congressional district, so all 435 in the appendix. So if you're interested, if you talk to members and you want to highlight what's going on in their district, every district has tech startups. One of the little interesting things that I thought was just fascinating, when you calculate the number of technology startups in California, it works out to a new startup every 3 minutes. I mean, really, when you think of it, it's mind-boggling. I mean, California's a big place, but every 3 minutes in California, over the last 10 years, a tech startup has emerged. It's really amazing. So this report is not designed to lay out a comprehensive agenda for entrepreneurial policy. A lot of people have done great work in that space. But let us suggest a few big areas to be thinking about. Relevant to what we're talking about this week in the Hill, tax reform. I think that there are some good components in the tax reform bills, but there's also some problematic ones. If we really want the tax reform package to spur entrepreneurship, it was very, very good. They took that provision out of the Senate bill that would have taxed options when they were vested rather than when they were exercised. That would have been a terrible result. It looks like that's been exercised, which is good. But at least I think the Senate bill has restricted R&D deductibility, which I think is a mistake. That's going to make it harder for companies to startup technology companies to be able to thrive. We would have liked the Senate. We would have liked both bills to expand the research and development tax credit, particularly what's called the alternative simplified credit. To their credit, they retained the credit at 14%. That's pretty anemic relative to our competitors. We're about 32nd now in the world in R&D tax credit generosity. Other countries are basically designing their tax codes to support technology-based firms, including technology-based startups. There's a number of other more arcane provisions, but essentially a couple of these provisions, Section 469 and 382, essentially make it easier for pre-revenue companies that just don't have tax liability yet, to be able to gain some advantages that they can then use that tax help to reinvest going forward. And that's pretty important, as John alluded to, that there's been a decline in some of these pre-revenue technology startups. I don't want to say it's easy to start a technology startup in writing an application for a smartphone, but it is easier. You don't have to put as much money into it, and you can get to market relatively quickly. But when you're building a new semiconductor or something around sort of atom-based innovation, if you will, a new biological molecule, a new kind of energy conversion device. That's hard to do. You have to put a lot of money in there, and you don't get it back for a long period of time. If you're lucky, you get it back. So that's why it's, I think, important to think about some of these other provisions. Secondly, we need to do a better job of regulation. There are a slew of regulatory barriers that we can do better on. You just use an example in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry. We need to continue to do a good job on the drug approval. That's why the bill. Remind me the name of the bill where you put money in. You can. PDUFA, yeah, sorry, Stephen Ezell wrote a report on that. Reauthorizing PDUFA, which gives resources to the FDA to approve drugs, not approve drugs, but to go through the approval process of the denier approval process quickly. Those kinds of things are very, very important. And we shouldn't think about regulation as just sort of cutting regulatory bodies. We should think about enabling them to make the right decisions at the right speed. That includes the Patent Office, which has gotten better at backlogs, but still has backlogs. Small Business Administration is an important entity for this, Office of Advocacy, but the Office of Advocacy is like firing grape shot when we need to be firing bazookas or rifles. It's focusing on advocacy for cigarette companies, restaurants. Again, the limited amount of effort the federal government can make, and a group like SBA should really be focusing their advocacy on regulations related to high-growth technology-based startups much more than they are right now, which is a very scattershot approach at SBA. It's small business, not high-growth innovation-based businesses. STEM skills should have been capitalized. We need to do a better job. STEM entrepreneurship. STEM is a core ingredient of entrepreneurship, of high-tech entrepreneurship, not just the inventors themselves, but the staff that they have to be able to do that. So that's everything from immigration policy to doing a much better job at our university and PhD level, BS and PhD level. Tech transfer. We We don't do a very good job. We don't do, let me put it this way, we underperform in terms of our potential. When you look at the spread of technology commercialization through the United States, you find that there are some institutions that are doing an amazing job. University of Utah, MIT, Caltech, University of Washington, just to name a few. But then you have a wide array of ones that are middle of the road at best. And we need to make an effort to bring the bottom and the middle much farther up so that everybody's performing at a much higher level to be able to take technology that's coming out of our labs or our universities and get it into the marketplace. And there's a number of different reports that my colleague Stephen Ezell has written on this, including a recent report with Brookings on what to do. So with that, I will stop, and let me just turn it over to Jeff. Jeff, you're welcome to come up or do your comments from
Well, thank you all for coming in, and good morning. I want to thank Rob and John for this excellent report and ITIF. I think that they're really to be commended because, unfortunately, this is a topic that we don't understand enough about, and I think that Rob and John have both indicated that up on Capitol Hill, where I spent most of my career, there is this understanding that these nation's small businesses are the real job creators. I think that you've unpacked a lot of that, and so I think that is going to be helpful going forward. I thought I would make comments here, and we're happy to talk more about this during the panel, that since we're in tax reform here on the Senate floor, when we're up on Capitol Hill talking to a lot of policymakers, we talk about how there's really three types of businesses out there in the country if you really think about it. And tax reform that we're considering now really speaks to at least two out of the three of these quite well. The first is the nation's small businesses that we've talked about, and there's a lot of discussion going on about what to be done about the pass-through rate, and we see some members of the Senate withholding their votes trying to get more generosity for pass-throughs going on here. And I think that ultimately, if the bill is to be successful, they'll get to a place where those small businesses are going to be aided. And then, of course, you have large companies. These are established firms. These are usually making a profit, and they're going to benefit from a reduction in the corporate rate and a new territorial tax system and repatriation and all these types of things. And so I think the tax bill really goes a long way in those two areas. But as Rob and John's report points out, there's really this third type of firm out there, and it's the high-growth startup. And this is where the net new jobs come from in our country. And I think that Congress needs to pay special attention to this type of firm because they don't generally benefit from a lot of the things that the nation's small businesses benefit from or the nation's large businesses benefit from. And the reason for that is because they start off small, but there's never an attitude of trying to stay small forever. They're not like a barber shop or a restaurant or a dry cleaner where they're quite comfortable to make a certain amount of money and just exist in that space forever. There's very much a go big or go home attitude about what the high growth startup is trying to do. And this type of company is often taking investment capital for many years from the members of NVCA, and they're oftentimes not making a profit at all. In many cases, in the case of biotech and biopharma, they're not even generating any revenue as they go through the regulatory process to try and have a new drug or device approved. And I think that there needs to be more of a recognition of that. And again, I think that this report will help us as we talk a lot about that. There are some things in the tax reform bill, to be fair, that have either been sustained or put in. I think that will be helpful, but certainly more could be done. Happy to be here with Bio today. I think that we've had a great partnership with them and the Angel Capital Association and a few other firms out there to try and really talk a lot about these issues. And I wanted to also note that I think that more needs to be understood about the degree to which the competition for high-growth startups has become a global game. Because there seems to be this attitude that since we have Silicon Valley here in our country, or we've got the Route 128 corridor up where MIT is, that somehow that's going to exist in our country forever. But the reality is that's just not the case. If you look out 20 years ago, about the United States startups received about 90% of global venture capital investment. 10 years ago, that figure dropped to 81%. And last year, that number dropped to 54%. So in 20 years, we dropped from getting 90% of the global pie to 54%. And it looks as if in the near future, that's going to drop to 1/2. And so the good news is the pie has gotten bigger. There are new pools of capital that are overseas. But as a global matter, it really demonstrates the United States is not the only game in town anymore. And the reason for that is both that we're doing things that are harmful to a lot of these high-growth startups, but at the same time, a lot of countries are really rolling out the red carpet. And John mentioned just coming back from Singapore. I could tell you, many anecdotes of that I've received from some of the members that I represent in just how aggressive that government is in trying to court people from a tax perspective, from a regulatory perspective, from an immigration perspective. And so I think that we really need to be cognizant of the degree to which other countries are courting a lot of U.S. companies, but perhaps more importantly, let's talk about the next generation of companies. Let's talk about the entrepreneur who 15 years ago would have desperately needed to come to the United States to start his or her firm because that was the place that you needed to be to start it. Now that person could stay in his or her own country. They could go to some third country because, again, there are new pools of capital out there. And then we're making it harder, I think, from an immigration perspective and some other areas to come here in the first place. So happy to expand on these thoughts, but I thought I would just tee it up with that, Rob. And
Great.
Thank you again for the great work.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Scott, you're welcome to do it from there. Great.
Great. Thank you so much. And I wanted to first thank John and Rob for such an excellent, excellent report. I'm going to use my brief time, and let me just see if there we go, absolutely. I'm going to use a brief time here just to comment on what I think really is an excellent report. And I think that fundamentally has the potential in this town, and hopefully more generally, to start changing the conversation about how we think about small businesses and entrepreneurship and the role that they play in competitiveness, economic growth, and some of our most urgent social and economic challenges. So let's just, kind of start here. I think maybe, we'll see. Let me just make sure. Okay, good. Okay, there we go. So this is a picture of, in fact, the Santa Clara Valley in 1926. And the great thing about this picture is if you look very carefully, you can see the new Apple headquarters. That's like its location. That was what that place looked like a long time ago, but not infinitely long ago. Not hundreds of years ago. And the point is that I think around the country, I think around the world, you have a large number of policymakers, a large number of stakeholders who want to somehow build their field of dreams, be the next Silicon Valley, somehow make that activity happen. But I think that there's been fundamental misconceptions about how to get there. One is don't try to be the next Silicon Valley, but even more importantly is what is the nature of the growth that leads to these kinds of outcomes. So let me be clear. I think that John and Rob have done an incredibly excellent report, and I think we should contrast that with what is now an accepted narrative, at least when I come to DC, about entrepreneurship. It is this story of declining business. What we hear is declining business dynamism, which is absolutely an accurate statement based on a quantity-based measure from the longitudinal business statistics, as well as the data that John put together. Rob, I'm going to shamelessly steal here. Hold on. Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay, good, great, sorry. Right? And let me be clear of what the implication of that is. If you believe that what you're getting is a decline in entrepreneurship, the right policy response is to do everything to start more companies. Who knows where the growth is going to come from? Just start more restaurants. Right? Do everything you can. Dramatically reduce the cost of starting a business. Let me be clear, which is a good policy. We should lower barriers to business entry. The challenge, though, is that when you start to think about it and you look at a world in which over the course of 10 years, the number of, say, for example, MIT seniors who join startup companies is now in excess of 20% of MIT grads go to these young startups upon graduation. They are not joining, by and large, small restaurants or plumbers, right? They're trying to join the next Google or the next Facebook or the next Amazon, right? And that leads, as I said, Rob, right, at least I got it in the kind of full tweet here, right? There's too much entrepreneurship disruption running wild. There's too little entrepreneurship economy stalling out. And so, okay, so to that kind of, and I do think that this kind of disjunction between these two perspectives is just absolutely fundamentally has kind of created a stall in the conversation around the role of entrepreneurship in economic performance. And that's where I think John and Rob's excellent report comes in. They ask two really good questions. What's the state of American technology-based startups? And given what they find, what's the agenda? And so just kind of really quickly, John did a great job of covering this. First, they find, relative to a story of that secular decline in the BDS, they find using their data, selecting on these industries, there's an increase in the number of these kinds of companies. Moreover, right, these kinds of companies really are creating the kinds of jobs that we want. But there's dramatic differences across places. I live in Massachusetts, in Cambridge. That's all you see. Obviously, there are also, as I'll show you in just a second, there are also, of course, pizza shops and lawyers and dentists and so on and so forth. But there's a tremendous amount of orientation around these good jobs, tech startups. In contrast, you go to other places, much more rare. People really can't even connect with that. Question is, how should we think about these results from a broader, beyond the data policy kind of synthetic perspective? So I'd say three big takeaways, and this is going to kind of build directly on the work with Jorge Guzman. The first insight is just to really take on board that new companies vary widely in their at-founding orientation towards growth. You could think of that as tech-based, growth orientation, innovation orientation, whatever you want. That is a real difference. There's just a big difference between the founders of the Harvard bookstore and Jeff Bezos at founding starting Amazon.com. They just did different things. The second, and this is based on some of the work that we've done using business registration records and predictive analytics, is just high growth outcomes are massively, massively skewed by orders of magnitude towards those firms that signal an intention to grow at founding. And that's a little bit, right, that's extremely consistent with the story that you just heard. If you select into these sectors, if you undertake corporate governance activities, if you do a whole bunch of things that are associated with growth, right, that you're trying, that they all want to get money from Jeff's constituency, right, they're seeking that growth path. That turns out to have dramatic, so just to give you a sense, if you pick an arbitrary company from the economy, and I just give you two facts about it, it got a patent in its first year, or applied for a patent, and it's registered in Delaware, which makes it kind of open for investment from just company. That company is 20,000% more likely to achieve a very high growth outcome of like either more than 1,000 employees, IPO, or acquisition. Okay, large acquisition. Okay? That, once you use that, you can end up turning that to allow for an incredibly arbitrarily detailed understanding of the geography and nature of this growth over time. But what's the real big message is, one, after you control for growth orientation, after you control for tech-based startup, U.S. doesn't really have a startup formation rate problem. What's the problem we have? We have a scaling problem. And that points to a very different policy agenda. Let me just take two policy implications. I just want to use my time. So one, I think that, Karen Mills, who is the administrator of the SBA under President Obama, I think was, as well as several other recent SBA administrators, have done a good job elevating the quality of that agency according to its mission. The problem is, it's the wrong agency. It's a crazy, let me be clear, if we want to have an agency to support dentists and lawyers and plumbers, that's fantastic. But colliding that agency with the agency supposed to be helping the firms that are funded by Jeff's group, that's crazy. We should either call it the Young Business Administration, the Tech Business Administration, the Innovation Business, I don't care what you call it. But the SBA is literally in its name, it's designed to be the wrong thing, to keep those businesses small. What you want is growing businesses. That's what creates jobs. Businesses that dramatically grow to thousands of times relative to their original size. We've worked in a program that I founded with Bill Allett and Fiona Murray at MIT, the Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program. We've worked with ecosystems more than 40 now, about around 40 around the world in a very organized way. And let me just push on, I think, something that Jeff said. This is outside the United States. This isn't an agenda item. This is the agenda item. How to form and scale innovation-driven companies that drive economic and social progress. And they're willing to do a huge amount in Singapore, in Beijing, in Israel, in London, in various other places, in Tokyo, in Seoul, to make that happen. And in a time of right, where the U.S., I think, is ceding leadership on some other dimensions, it would be a tragedy if this particular crown jewel in America's economic prosperity was diminished due to lack of policy attention and activity. So I want to credit John and Rob again. I'm sorry I overtook my time. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. I'll turn over to David. Just to support Scott's point, I was in Kazakhstan 2 weeks ago, and most of the questions I got asked and most of the discussions I had over drinks were, how should we be designing our high-growth entrepreneurship system to build technology companies in Kazakhstan? So
Yeah, it's
everywhere. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting us to be a part of this panel. So I'll give the perspective of for the biotechnology industry and what it takes to get entrepreneurs and investment into these startups. When we looked at the 10 industries that John put on the slide, there are two that really, in my view, separate out from the other 8. And those tend to have two main policy buckets and other requirements that the others don't. So one is, for the device group and the biopharmaceutical group, is this regulatory policy environment need. So when we say regulatory, we're talking about, of course, the FDA and the needs there. So what, at a high level, what is needed is to have certainty in the regulatory system. So investors, whether it's venture capital or angel investors, if there's uncertainty on a goalpost of what is going to be required to run a clinical trial 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road, that'll drive investors out. And we saw this happen roughly 10 years ago in certain disease areas. The other aspect, which Rob touched on, is this unique part of the industry or feature in the industry where the industry actually pays user fees to the FDA, and those fees are used for the FDA to review drugs. And this User Fee Act, this is actually the 25th year, was actually, the latest version was signed by President Trump this summer. And Bio spent 2 years negotiating that on behalf of the industry so that we could explain the needs of the patients and the review process and how it can be modernized to incorporate things like biomarkers, new diagnostic techniques, and also input from patients. So having those policy elements robust, efficient, and certain makes it more attractive for early stage investment. So the other side is the capital formation and tax policy side, and that's in our industry heavily slanted to the small companies in terms of needs. And I'll get to that in just a moment with a few facts in the industry. So many of you might not know this, but in the biopharmaceutical industry in the United States has about 1,500 companies, but 90% of them don't have a single product on the market. So they are in this class we talked about with pre-revenue tech startups. And if we look at the private companies that haven't gone public yet, it's actually 97% of the companies. So why is that? Well, it turns out that another unique factor of the biotech sector is that on average it takes about 10 to 12 years to develop a drug, and the most recent direct cost is $1.4 billion. So you put that up in front of investors, and if you add on other uncertainties or unfavorable tax policies, it makes it a difficult investment scenario. And those are the averages. So we have board members, for example, that have spent 20 years developing a drug and $2 billion and still no product on the market. So you can imagine the differences between that and other tech startups that can put out a beta product and can maybe start up some or have some early sales, some revenue coming into the firm versus basically having zero revenue, losing money for years on end. So the other reason this is important is that those companies are small companies, but if we look at the drugs that have been coming out of the FDA approvals for the last 3 to 5 years, 65% of those drugs are actually coming from small companies. And so it's imperative that the small companies have the right environment to flourish so that the large companies can actually go in and license these drugs and co-develop and share the costs because the costs are so high. And when we look to the future right now, we have 6,000 programs in development in the pipeline, and 70% of those are coming from small companies. So it's quite incredible statistic. 70% of all drugs being developed today are from those small startups. So moving on to some of the policy recommendations that Rob had showed, what would also benefit these companies. There were two that stood out that we have been advocates of before, and those are the ones related to the net operating loss. So some of these startup biotech companies have these tax assets built up over time of, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars in net operating losses that are accrued. And because they can go for a decade or two without having any profits, they can't really utilize those tax benefits. So to have those tax assets remain in place during a change of ownership would be a positive. And on the other side, the allowing some of the benefits to pass through, whether it's R&D tax credit or this NOL tax asset, to pass on to investors would also be a very positive thing. And you also touched on the some of the new tax proposals. The R&D tax credit has been a big positive for U.S. biotechs, and making that permanent was a great thing. In the new tax bills, especially on the House side, there's another R&D tax credit that was removed from the current bill, and the Senate side, that latest proposal actually cut this other R&D tax credit in half, and that is the orphan drug tax credit. So something that's happened in the industry is that we've had this synergy of technologies coming out of how you design drugs and what we find in biology, and most of that is uncovering the genetic basis of disease. And we've seen a lot of investors come in, a lot of entrepreneurs leave universities to start up companies around orphan drugs. And there's an Orphan Drug Act that touches on both of the sides I had mentioned, which is the regulatory side, where you can have faster review and approval with orphan drugs. This was an act that was signed back in 1983, but it has a tax component to it where you can get 50% of your R&D tax credited. So to lose that could take out a lot of investors from this space that is really booming right now, because we have synergies more on the scientific side and a lot of enthusiasm of how we can go after these new rare diseases, or diseases without any current therapies. So that is something that is a high priority for bio, and we'd like to see kept as is. and I'll just end with the other aspects of the current tax proposals. Certainly, it's favorable to have the lower overall corporate tax rate, territorial system for the biotech pharmaceuticals. And in terms of repatriation, now it's the large companies that we all know, the Johnson & Johnsons, the Pfizers, that have cash overseas in Europe, Japan. To repatriate that at a lower rate will actually, at least in my opinion, be a boon for the startup companies. Because what we've seen over time is that the pharmaceutical companies that are the large companies that sell products are very dependent on getting their future drugs from the small companies, the startups that don't have that money. So repatriating, you see numbers of 100 billion plus coming back into the U.S., they can put that money to work in these licensing agreements. And the trend that we're seeing is that the large companies are going earlier and earlier in the pipeline, and they are actually striking billion-dollar plus deals with companies that just have laboratory work. They're not even in human trials yet. And so some of these deals can be $50 million up front, $100 million, and then as the drug progresses, the large company will pay $100 million, a couple $100 million as the positive data comes out. And so it's possible that could be a policy initiative that, or tax reform initiative that changes what we see on the startup side for biotechs. So with that, I'm happy to take any other questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So we have a fair amount of time for questions, so we want to just raise your hand and identify who you are and what your question is. I'm going to go in the order I see them. Yes, sir, and hold on 1 second for the mic to come around.
That is a step in the right direction as far as increasing the commercialization capabilities of these universities. If not, what could be done differently? Do you have any policy recommendations for universities and commercial?
All right, just as a disclaimer, I did not pay you to ask that question. That was a proposal that my colleague Stephen Zell and I came up with a couple of years ago after looking at some of the best universities around the country, including Georgia Tech, who were really doing amazing work to link what they're doing in both in the business schools and the engineering schools better to manufacturing ecosystems. And so it was a bill by Senator Chris Coons and Stephen, who was the Republican sponsor? Was it Lindsey Graham, I think? Yeah, Senator Graham. That was put into law under the Defense Act, Defense Authorization Act last year. The idea behind the bill is to enable a national competition of universities who would be focused on commercializing manufacturing-related technology and working with startups and existing companies. And the idea would be, if you have this competition, that universities are going to have to really raise their game if they want to get some of the funding from that. So I think it's a very important program. It's a modest amount of money, but I think it's one of those initiatives where if it scales up and if it is successful, it could easily scale up. Problem is it was enacted into law last January, I believe, but it's been in the DOD bailiwick now, and DOD, frankly, has been sitting on it and hasn't implemented it. We think that's not good. They should really get off their duff and implement this as quickly as possible. It also received an additional authorization this year in the new defense bill, I believe. So it has support in Congress, and I think it could be a very important new kind of initiative as long as DOD, just gets it off the ground and puts out an RFP. And I know there's a lot of interest around the country from universities we've spoken with who want to be competing in this and upping their game. So thank you. Joel?
Yeah, Joel, you got
Hi, Joel Yudkin, High Road Strategies. It's very interesting stuff. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to restrict myself here. First, and they're both data questions. One is that the number, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, QCEW, there's about 340,000 small manufacturers under 500 employees, and about a little under 300,000 in 2017 of the of under 50. And I'm assuming most startups are probably in the smaller category. So I was trying to square that with the numbers, because you had about 170,000. Are you? Of course, this is establishments versus firms. So, in fact, that even makes it even more dominant that what you're talking about are the high-tech startups tend to, in the manufacturing sector, I should qualify that. So I wanted to also get a sense of the breakdown. You have 6 industries that are manufacturing and 3 that are services. So I want to get a better understanding of the breakdown on the the numbers as well as employment. And the second question is that I saw that, I mean, you're all looking more at the dynamics of this over time, as well as just the snapshot, that the entry versus the, how many leave. I forgot, maybe it was your chart. It looked like we are losing more than we were starting. Is that right, in recent years? I was wondering the churn rate, how long these last. I mean, when we talk about creating jobs, we're also turning over jobs. So I wanted to get more clarification.
So John, why don't you go first, and then Scott?
Hi, Joel. So with regard to the industry breakdown within the report itself, we do highlight the average firm size for each of the technology-based industries. So it's in there. I can list them out for you one by one if you need be. At the same time, we also do list out the average size of a tech startup based on state. So the data that you are looking for is in there. And as I said previously, manufacturing-based startups, they more or less tend to be on the right side of the number 10, and service-providing startups on the left side of 5.
I think, Joel, partly to answer your question, most manufacturing startups are not in the technology sector. They're, as defined this way, they might be auto suppliers, they might be making carpets, who knows what they're making. So, yeah, you're right, those have declined as overall, but in this space, there's been growth from a more narrower focus on technology. Yeah?
Yeah, so I think that just 3 big points. The first is that, exactly the point that was just made. There's this massive gap between the rates of entry and exit across the entire economy, including services sectors. You know what I'm saying? So which the LBD would do, right? Which is looking at just total net entry and exit of establishments, right, or firms, depending on the measure. Those who will have a little bit of orientation that at least you have to have an employee in the LBD, so you can't just be just a corporation. You just have to have an employee, but one employee is enough to be in the data set. That dynamic has changed. There's been probably, that's not my main focus, but there's clearly been an evisceration of your mom and pop stores in downtowns, mom and pop, even suppliers probably, that lots of consolidation in those industries. That's the first point. That's just not true once you either select on narrowly defined technology sectors, or if you go to the kind of work that we've done more generally that looks across all firms that are formed, but looks for that growth orientation and growth intentions of the founders. The second part, and this is not to, I love what John and Rob and ITIF have done. I would make the point, though, that there's, when we think about tech-based startups, then we go to industries, there's going to be a big gap there. So you think about most successful firm in the last 20 years is Amazon. When it came into the data set, it was a bookseller. For sure. That's what it was. Zappos sold shoes. Right? That's a massive employer now. Right? Even companies, and this is really, I think, a part of, Rob's broader legacy at ITIF. Information technology has rolled over the economy, and it's now reshaping more traditional industries. And I'm not sure that our industrial classification system, which I have great appreciation for, having done a lot of work in that area, really is caught up with what's going on. right? Startups are reshaping, local markets. One of the most successful successful companies in Massachusetts the last few years, Care.com. For those of you who are parents, you know that because basically it organized the nanny market. Wonderful company, female founder, exactly what we want. Created many, many more jobs through the platform as well as through the direct employment in the firm, but has enabled tremendous opportunities on both sides of that market. That's in personal care services. That's the industry they're in. Do you see what I'm saying? Now they have patents, they have trademark, they have VC, they have, the full round. And so I think that just we have to kind of bring on board that we have to catch up to what those innovators and entrepreneurs are doing, right? So Jeff's client, I keep saying clients, but sort of constituency, right, is very good at that. And we need, as our national statistical agencies, academics, policymakers, we need to get better at that.
Yes, sir. Back here, and then here. So.
Hi, Michael Weissman. So thanks for your report. John, Rob, and all the ladies. I'm wondering if there's something that you can keep out of within the dynamic of your firm, your firm existence. I understand why you chose 10 years as the definition for a startup. Is there something about the various variables you chose that allows us to understand the probability of success after making it to 10 years or beyond? Is there something about how fast you scale or how many employees you have after 3 years, or where you are, what regional ecosystem of innovation you're in, any of those things that you pull out? Can you tease out a lesson?
John addressed that. I'm not sure we have a lot on that, but then Scott, obviously you've done lots of work there too. So John, you want to take it?
Yep. So with regard to your point, Michael, we do address it by looking at firm survival rates across 20-year periods. So in the report itself, we look at a new firm in, say, the pharmaceutical industry, the computer and electronics industry. What's the probability of them surviving past their first year, their fifth year, and so on and so forth? Because it's a firm-level data set, there's definitely a lot of opportunity for permutations in the data analysis that we don't really go into, because if I had to do that, it would probably take another half year and another 150 pages tacked on, and which very few people would read. But besides that, I think we do have some indication of kind of what you are looking for. But that's kind of the nature of firm-level data sets. As long as you have an interesting research question, you can just go ahead and.
You want to just verbally describe these? There's by the way, the full report, which is quite long, is on the website in PDF form, and you can download. But John will talk a couple of tables.
Oh yeah. So with regard to kind of firm survival rates, which probably speaks to your point, let's see. I'll just read from here. First-year survival rates averaged 75% from 1998 to 2007, increased to a high of 90% for firms started in 2011 and has decreased since. Fifth-year survival rates have demonstrated a more gradual increase, with survival rates for firms started in 2011 an exception. In other words, 40% of firms established in 1998 still operated in 2003, while 55% of firms established in 2010 still operated in 2015. So those are some statistics, and we also break it down by industry. So knock yourself out with the report, send me an email, give me a call, I'm happy to speak to you. Free coffee would also be good.
Got any?
Yeah. The only thing I'd say, and I just emphasize, and I sort of hinted at this, no matter how skewed you think the distribution of growth is, it's even more skewed than that. Just you can't imagine how skewed distributions these are. And it goes a little bit to, once again, VC, right? Failure. In other words, if a growth-oriented firm is 10 years in and is still 10 people, and they, Jeff's, constituency hasn't come calling and whatever, and they're still kind of playing around with some gadget, that's not a success. They're persisting, but it's not really success. What happens is, out of that, let's even say 1 or 2% of firms that are even trying to grow, of all firms founded, maybe 5 to 10% of them actually grow, of that, 1 or 2% grow explosively and create, the mega companies that you know today. Once you sort of do that, you're talking, so the success rates so what you're talking is that, like, okay, so the first part is super skewed. What you should be looking at is the probability of that outsized success. That outsized success tends to be, there are kind of a bunch of relatively straightforward pieces of the corporate governance and firm formation playbook that are relatively good predictors of that probability of growth. And I could talk more about that work if you're interested.
I mean, one point about that, Scott, I think is important when people get in this debate. They look at some of the returns that some of the successful firms have, and they say, oh, those returns are too high. But what they're not looking at is the net expected value of all those investments.
Absolutely, right. Because the sector is distributed across a very wide number of investments, most of which fail. Right? Even a VC firm is looking for one in a group of, say, 10 to be super successful, maybe 3 or 4 base hits, and the rest you're going to write off. And you'd rather, interestingly, what we teach when we teach entrepreneurship, we want students, if you know things are going bad, it's not going to be the great firm, cut it off. Guillotine.
If you're going to fail, fail quickly.
Yeah, because then Jeff's, right, then a VC will come back to you, right, with your next idea.
Chuck, I'm going to go in order.
Sorry.
I'll call you next. So this gentleman here, Chuck, and then here. And why don't we do this? Why don't we ask 3 questions now, because we're running short on that, and then we'll do the answers. So if you could go right here.
Great. I just have Lucian Rendazizi from SRI. I just have a quick question for John. You talked about the correlation between startup activity and an index of, I think, like 25, 29 factors that ITIF had put together. Are there any particular elements within that index that are actually strongly correlated? In other words, can I tie it specifically to regional R&D spending or regional S&T employment or regional presence of universities or whatever? I'd be interested in that.
I think I saw a couple over here. Here and then Chuck.
Hi, David Bain with the Technology Safety Council. My question relates to the policy recommendations. I feel like each of the panelists spoke to the impact part of the equation, how tech startups, scalable tech startups, are having an outside impact, an outsized impact on the economy, but also on society. And my question is, would it make sense to add to the official list of policy recommendations some kind of acknowledgement of the outsized impact on economy and society, and to seek mechanisms and means to reward scalable tech startups that positively impact society? Each of your panelists, Dave Thomas, spoke about for instance, the orphan drug issue, how that is a way that there are mechanisms to encourage that sort of thing rather than another $1,000 EpiPen startup, for instance. Scott talked about MIT's recognition. I think Vivek Wadhwa is the academic that's sort of leading the charge on this. And Jeff, in the VC industry, even though you didn't touch upon it really, I think it's well known that almost all the VCs are looking to have an impact play or two in their portfolio of investments. So that's my question. Would you add that sort of consideration to your list of policy recommendations? Thank you.
Thank you. Go here and then Chuck. Yeah.
Hi, Derek Hill from National Science Foundation. 2 quick things. One is I'm interested if you did any looking into the fact that I've seen anecdote reports and more detailed things that the huge tech companies, Amazon, Google, Apple, are acquiring a lot of tech startups, and there's a lot of concern that essentially they are sort of controlling the type of technology that's coming out because they have a near monopoly position. A lot of political power in the U.S. economy, and how that's affecting innovation and sort of formation and maybe survival rate of techs. high-tech startups. The second issue, I think, related to the previous question, is the quality and type of innovation. I think that should be something we should be looking at. For example, I've seen several studies saying Big Pharma has done very little actual innovation over the last few years. A lot of their patenting is just taking a drug they've already patented and doing several tweaks on it, and they get a new patent on it. And if that's kind of the way their objectives, and that's what they're interested in, then if they're funding all these small biofarmers, I think that should be of some concern.
Okay, thank you. And then the last one, Chuck. Wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. No, just to join up, we've been focused a little bit on the big hits, and when you're in Europe, one of the problems with developing Amazon is that Amazon's already there. But most of the venture capital companies, I'm sure Jeff can point out, actually don't succeed. And there's what they call the living dead, where there are companies of 120 million and maybe 110 employees, which, and by the way, that would be like iRobot or Aerodyne up where you are. iRobot is not big, but they're national in running robots. A number of the companies grow, but the market itself is not so scalable, at least not with that management team. But if you're a regional development person, you don't, that's success. So we have this fixation on the unicorn approach that you really want it to go to $1 billion, and I'm just not sure that that's the only metric that should be used. And many of the venture companies don't get that, and the ramp up for acquisition can be a long time. And just your thoughts. I mean, I think we're leaving out of
So, John, why don't you do the first one? I don't think we did that, but it's a really interesting idea.
Yep. Short answer is no. Happy to talk with you after, since I did both reports, so easy enough.
We will be issuing a blog on that at some point, because it's pretty easy to do and it's a good idea. We can just correlate that pretty easily to see which of those 26 factors in the state is most correlated with this variable. My guess is it's probably going to be R&D or a number of STEM but we'll see. It's an interesting question. Let me turn it over to Jeff maybe on this question of large firms, and there are arguments on the other side that this is, if you have a sell-off opportunity, it's motivating to take the risk. But why don't you go ahead?
Sure, I would just make a few points. I mean, the first is that there's something going on here where you've had the rise of a lot of these very large tech companies. And July 29th, 2015, the top 5 largest companies in the United States by market cap were all the big tech companies, all of which were venture backed. And so a lot of these companies have grown very, very large, but also at a time when the public markets have become very hostile to the so-called small cap IPO. And so a lot of venture capital backed companies that used to go public at much smaller capitalizations are no longer doing that. And there are a lot of reasons that probably deserve a panel of its own as to why it is that the public markets are no longer welcoming to small companies. But the reality is that that's what's going on. And so I think that you've seen a lot of this M&A activity because you have companies that perhaps aren't looking to IPO until they're at least $1 billion valuation, if not more. I mean, I've certainly heard a lot of VCs talk about the fact that they're not even thinking about IPOing until a company is a $5 billion value company or something to that effect. And so I do think that you've seen some of these tech companies kind of come in and fill that space. I think also you've seen the growth in so-called corporate venture capital. It's now a reality that about 20% of NVCA's membership are the venture capital arms of existing corporations. And they're doing that for a lot of reasons, but one of them is to look at companies that they ultimately would like to acquire to kind of bring the technology, bring the innovation into the corporate parent.
David, do you want to respond to this sort of assertion around Me Too-ism?
Yeah, so that has come up over the years, and we actually initiated a study to look at, is the industry just tweaking drugs and getting patents? Is there true innovation going on in the industry? And we have a report online, I can send you the link later, that breaks down all of the investment activity and financing activity from startups to pharmaceutical licensing, and we tagged every single investment as to whether or not it was a Me Too, tweak, repurposed drug, something like that, or a novel new medicine, and the numbers come up to be close to 90% is novel. And I think the industry, they definitely did that with a lot of different drugs over the years. Things are very different now. I think when you look at the pipelines of the major pharmaceutical companies, over 50% are coming from the small companies, and even the other 50% that's in-house are very, very novel drugs. And if you look at just cancer, for example, the big breakthroughs that we've seen with respect to this immuno-oncology, harnessing the immune system to go after cancer, those are all very novel drugs, and those are predominantly the large companies that have come up with those.
Yeah, I'd just add, we issued a report a year and a half ago or so called Life Sciences is Politically Purple. In other words, that both the libertarian right who hate NIH and the hard left that want all drugs to be funded by the government are wrong. And we did look at the literature on that issue. And I think the point is it's less than people think, and it has declined also because the sort of technology opportunities in life sciences over the last 5 years, and now particularly with technologies like CRISPR, really opening up all big horizons and ability of big data sets and all that stuff. Let me respond to the policy the question here, and then I want to see if, Scott, you can sort of answer this question of unicorn versus middles, if you will. I like to joke, although I'm not really joking, that only government can pick winners. And the reason I say that is because the scholarly economics of innovation clearly have shown for decades that technology innovations have spillovers. And some of those spillovers are quite big. In other words, that a firm, even one of Jeff's firms, they don't capture, even the firm with the least spillovers of Jeff's firm don't capture all the benefits. Those benefits spill over to society, to competitors, et cetera. That's why we have the R&D tax credit. Now, there are going to be some innovations that have really big spillovers because they respond to big societal challenges. Energy is an important one. Health is another one. And there we can't really resolve that with just sort of a better ecosystem of tax or regulation or all that. You have to be more targeted. Things like the ARPA-E program, which we released a report on last week that looked at that. That's essentially saying, hey, we think that clean energy is an important social value. We're going to have a targeted program focused on it to supplement these sort of environmental or ecosystem kinds of programs. Orphan drugs is another. I have to say I was disappointed, I know Chuck was as well, when Congress eliminated the Advanced Technology Program from NIST, because that was really, the innovation scholarly literature is very clear that if you want to, you can't just rely on ecosystem kinds of, you have to rely a little bit more on targeting and identifying the big technological challenges of American society. The best way to do that is with some kinds of focused grant or funding kinds of streams. So fully agree with you. It's hard to measure that in this data set, which was why we didn't do it, but I think it's an important area. Scott, I'll let you have the last word on this question of unicorn versus more middle ones that can still add real value.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to talk to Chuck offline around this. Let me say two things. First, I think the power of the report that Rob and John have put together here is they're looking at these sectors in aggregate over time. They're not just looking at the unicorns, and they paint this pretty important story about dynamism in, I think, the kind of key sectors that have been at the heart of American dynamism for a long time. So thank you very much. I consider, in the kind of work I'm talking about, iRobot and everyone that you think of as a success, even those mid-sized successes, even that is extraordinarily rare. It's just, we haven't really dealt with the fractal nature of those entrepreneurial outcomes. And just if you want, we have lots of papers on that I can show you. You know what I'm saying? But as John said, it's a kind of somewhat challenging read because I don't understand half of what's going on. So that's to say I have an extraordinary doctoral student, Jorge Guzman, has been leading that charge. But thank you very much.
By the way, I have to say, Scott, given that when we incorporated in Delaware and we only have 18 people there, I think we're a failure because we're not part of your group, although we're a nonprofit.
Yeah, exactly. We have a whole other project on that's a new agenda for us.
Interesting. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us. As I said, the report, the PowerPoint, and the video will be online. Please join me in thanking first of all, John for the great work, and then 3 panelists who were wonderful to me. So thank you.